Well, good morning and happy Thursday. So we're in our fourth day of our NCA speaker series with our seminar titled Learning the Three C's, Becoming a Competent Classroom Communicator. My name is Scott Myers and I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at West Virginia University. Today's topic is going to be teaching from the relational perspective. And as we learned yesterday, there are two perspectives that instructors should consider when teaching. The first is the rhetorical, which is all about the message design, the intentional creation of course materials that are all about the message. Okay. So yesterday we talked about how when you are creating a lecture or a syllabus or PowerPoint slides, how you have to think about your clarity, your relevance, and your use of humor in creating those documents, because they are really all about you. You take into consideration your students, you're creating those documents for your students, and so you want them to have some thought. All right, so that's the first perspective. The second perspective is called the relational perspective, and as I mentioned yesterday also, they are considered to be complementary. So effective teaching takes care of the message, which is rhetorical. Effective teaching also considers the student, which is the relational. Now, by definition or conceptualization, we consider the relational perspective to be, or to focus on how students and teachers create an interpersonal relationship by mutually working on this relationship. The idea here is that both teachers and students engage in behaviors that are respectful, they're mindful, and they're pleasant, right? We want to engage our students in a way that's going to make them feel as if they're important to the learning process. Now, again, we use the word relational or interpersonal even, that's fine. But we're not talking about an in-depth relationship that would be similar to a friendship or something like that. I often consider this, or I use the phrase, a working relationship, because it is indeed, a relationship that's going to last for an infant for a not so lengthy amount of time. I'll sometimes call it a communication relationship, because it really is about using interpersonal behaviors that will allow the two of us, meaning me, myself and my students, to communicate in an effective manner. So the idea here is that we want to mutually work toward the development of this relationship, which oftentimes is restricted to this semester, with our students, so that they feel that they are active participants in the learning process. Now, more so than the relational perspective, there are a lot of instructional and communication behaviors that could fall under this particular perspective. And I'm going to today focus on three. So these three behaviors are going to be nonverbal immediacy, affinity seeking, and confirmation. And as we talk about all three, you'll see that the common theme is making that student feel as if he or she is important to you and important to the relationship. All right, so let's go ahead and start and talk a little bit about immediacy. Now, this is just like credibility on day 2. Immediacy, particularly nonverbal immediacy, has been one of the most widely studied behaviors in the instructional communication discipline. Now, by definition, we say that immediacy behaviors are those that reduce the physical and the psychological distance between students and instructors. So the idea here is that when you engage in immediacy in the classroom, you're going to engage in behavior that not only makes the student feel closer to you psychologically, but also distance-wise. Now, keeping in mind that sometimes that is a little more difficult dependent on the structural confines of the classroom, but there are ways to work around that, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, immediacy also has a verbal component, but it's really not studied as much anymore. And one of the arguments is because a lot of verbal immediacy behaviors are encapsulated in other behaviors like such as self-disclosure and clarity, and possibly even relevance. But the idea here is, again, is that as an instructor, I want to engage in a variety of behaviors that will make the student feel as if that distance between the two of us is reduced. Even if there is, and there won't be, actually in most cases, a highly intimate relationship between you and your students. But these behaviors work well because they make students feel secure. They make them feel safe. So one of the things with nonverbal immediacy is just really thinking about the behaviors that you use. Now, since immediacy was brought into the communication discipline in 1979, there's been a little bit of thought about what are the actual behaviors. And while these might seem, they might seem a little bit prescriptive, but the reality is, just like a lot of things, is when it comes to nonverbal immediacy behaviors and using these, you have to use the ones that make the most sense for you. Nonverbal immediacy is one of those behaviors that if you're using them insincerely, most students can figure it out, and it's going to have a detrimental effect. So you want to be careful that you're not just engaged in this behavior because you've been told it's an effective behavior. All right, it is, but it also depends on how you can use it, just like everything else. So let's talk a little bit about some of those behaviors. They fall into just our general nonverbal categories, to be quite honest, and it really just depends also on how large the class is, how the class is set up. I mean, it can be difficult to be not. It can be difficult to employ some nonverbal immediacy behaviors because of where you're teaching, but that doesn't mean that you can't use others. Okay. So one of the easiest, I shouldn't say easiest, one of the nonverbal behaviors that you can use is your eye contact. I mean, and this is one behavior we ask students, does your instructor look at you when he or she talks with you? Does he or she, looking at someone as we know, or at least scanning the room is important to students. We've all been able to nip and instruct a student misbehavior simply by looking, right? You give the look to the student. It's not looking above the student, it's not looking down. And keep in mind, you can be nonverbal immediate and still have your lecture notes, right? You can still, you have to look up, you have to make sure that you make that eye contact with students. Your facial expression is key when being nonverbally immediate. This is one that we don't necessarily think about because we don't pay attention to it, right? We don't see our facial expressions on a day-to-day basis. But, obviously the most important one for most students is smiling when you're talking. Pretty much, I guess, anything other than just frowning, right? And keep in mind, too, that these immediacy behaviors are perceived by students as you using them with the entire class. So if I'm sitting here or standing and looking at all my students, or individual students as well, you're more likely probably to, use eye contact maybe with students in the first few rows. But it's just, between the eye contact and the facial expression, this is something that students do pay attention to. And you may not pay that much attention to them yourself. But please, start doing that. Look at your students and smile when you talk, and you will be perceived as nonverbally immediate. Another relates to your gestures. Do you gesture toward the students? Do you gesture when you talk? Some of us talk with our hands. Some of us like to, some of us are more reserved that way. But gesturing generally is seen as a nonverbally immediate behavior. And I think with this one, you have to just figure out what works best for you. Sometimes if some of us who are storytellers or get a little bit dramatic in the classroom, you'll use your arms, your hands, your whole body even much more than other people will. So so one thing to keep in mind is that even though we might all be nonverbally immediate, the extent to which we are or the behavior that we might use really is going to be dependent on ourselves. And it goes also into what we call our communicator style, which I'll talk about tomorrow, which I think is really one of the most important things when we're teaching in terms of just communication behavior. Obviously, your voice, we already talked about, on day one, where, dull, dry teachers, often are dull and dry because of the vocal elements that they're using. So we know that's a behavior of teaching effectiveness when you're not dry or dull. So you do have to think about your voice, which again is something you might not think of. And then we also have just body movement in general. Do you sit behind a desk? That's considered to be non-immediate. Do you stand when you talk or when you're teaching? Do you walk around the room? Now, I realize that sometimes it's difficult to walk around a room because you can't get in between the desks. One of the large lecture classes I teach in, all I can do is a 200 seat room. My options of moving are across, back, and then up the 2 aisles, which I will do. You have to be careful that when you're moving that hopefully student eyes are following you. So, if I go up an aisle and I'm in the back of the room, I need them to look at me while I'm also talking. And, students may want to write notes or something like that. So when it comes to body movement, you just need to think about what works for you. I've seen a few teachers as I walk around the halls in my building, and they're sitting on the desk as they lecture. Or as they talk with their students, and that seems to work for them. That's not something I would do personally, but that's okay, right? So the idea behind this nonverbal immediacy is just think about the behavior. So when I walk around a room, regardless of the size, when I am in a student's personal space, so to speak, or as I go in and out, I am reducing that distance, and students appreciate that in general. When I'm walking, I'm usually smiling, and I'm probably using body movement of some kind or gesturing, and making sure I look at individual students as I'm walking around. So a lot of this is, it's hard to separate all of that, but because they all do seem to work together. But nonetheless, you just need to think about how you're doing these behaviors, whether they're effective. And also just remember, like I said, you have to be sincere. Don't smile at your students if you're not in a smiling mood, because they'll understand that that's not really what's appropriate. If you do it repeatedly, that becomes a problem. If you can't move around, well, you can't move around. But you can do verbally immediate behaviors as well. You can call students by their name. That's probably one of the biggest behaviors to students in terms of all of our behaviors. If you know who they are, that makes them feel better. When you use their name when you call on them. I learn all my students' names as best I can, as soon as I can, because it does lend that sense of immediacy. I mean, what better way to reduce psychological distance than to know the name of the student, right? So asking students questions before class, going in doing that small talk, which some of us don't like, but and really, if you don't like it or you can't do it, then don't do it. That interpersonal chit chat, some students really enjoy, and some students don't. I mean, you pick up on that right away too. Humor is also considered to be a verbally immediate technique, and because these things do tend to overlap, which is sometimes problematic when you're trying to dissect the effect of each one. All right, so when it comes to immediacy, that is what you want to keep in mind here. Is those are your better behaviors to use. You really need to refrain from touch. Although some people argue, people say, well, I'm a hugger, and that's great and all that, but that's probably not necessarily the most appropriate. Not all students want that. Different cultures don't allow that. So touch is one of those behaviors we've learned over the years is just pretty much try to avoid. If there should be any touch, it needs to be functional. And you might even ask students, which can I reach into your space before you just do it? Like if I'm walking around, there's a question, and I'm looking over to look at the paper, I will ask, can I use your pen to write this? Or can I write on your paper? Because that means my hand's going to be right there. So do avoid touch for a whole host of other reasons too. All right, so, and the interesting thing too about immediacy is that it seems to account for so much, which is just amazing. But nonverbal immediate teachers are telling students they want to reduce that distance. I want to get to know you. I want to develop an interpersonal relationship with you. Like I said, I call it a communication relationship. I want to be immediate with my students because they respond to it. And you'll also realize, as we all know this, is that if there's a student who doesn't appreciate it or who doesn't like your immediacy gesture or technique, then don't use it, right? All right, sorry. I always drink. That's another thing. I always drink when I teach. So I usually bring a big ol' styrofoam cup from my Circle K convenience store. And that's another thing students associate with me is my big cup and my cologne. So, oh wow. All right, going off tangent, which is not a good thing, correct? All right, so let's move on then to affinity seeking, which I find to be one of the more interesting behaviors. It's not studied as much as instructional communication. I think there's some good reasons for it. I think it's more of a methodological problem than anything else. But the idea behind affinity, because I think we all do this, we don't realize we're doing it. When you engage in affinity seeking, what you're doing is you're using messages. These are often used intentionally too, just like the rhetorical behaviors, but this is all relational. It's not message driven. When we use affinity seeking strategies, what we're doing is we're engaging in messages as a way to generate liking for either ourselves or for the course content. We will have students who flat out say, I don't like this content. And that's challenging. So, you may have to engage in affinity seeking in order to get them to start to like it. Occasionally we have a student who doesn't like us, and we know it because they've either told us or they just behave in that way. And so you might want to engage in these for that too. Otherwise, you want to use these behaviors because, again, going back to affective learning from day one, affective learning is about lifelong learning. And if you can get students excited about what you're teaching now, they're going to be excited in general. And, so you want to build affinity. I think this can become particularly important when you're teaching lower level classes that lead directly to the upper division. Especially, if you, because you want to generate liking for the subject matter so students will continue in it. And that would apply really, I guess, to a lot of the classes we teach. But if you have areas of emphasis or different majors within your department, you know what I'm talking about. An intro health class, you want to create affinity for that content so they take the advanced health class, for example. All right, in your packet, I'm sorry, not in your packet, in today's readings, if you have already looked at them or if you have them handy, the Wanzer 1998 article contains a table that lists 25 affinity-seeking strategies. Now, I'm not going to go through all of those because we just don't have the time. But here's something we want to consider about affinity. The idea here is that teachers will use any of these 25 strategies as a way to generate liking for both themselves and also for the subject matter. But what we consider about this, about the use of these strategies, is that, they are purposeful. We're doing this on purpose. We're not randomly choosing something. It is strategic. But there are certain strategies that are more effective across the board. There are certain strategies that students respond to more favorably across the board. And there's also just strategies that you would always use or prefer using, or there are strategies you would never use. When I look at this list of 25, as I've taught this off and on over the years, I always comment, there's one or two here that I probably would not use with students. And it's primarily because I'm just not comfortable with that strategy. It might work for someone else. So anyway, if you have the Wanzer article, she has a list of most of the strategies. And let me go back and restate what I was saying. The early work found 25 strategies that teachers are perceived to use by students. And those 25 have been really formed the basis for research over the years. In Wanzer's article in 1998, she was interested in looking at not only the strategies that teachers use, but she also identified some strategies that students use with us, which is interesting. Oh, and I should go back and point out that students also use nonverbal immediacy behaviors with us as well. So it's a two-way street, and we do see that with some of these relational behaviors, is that we use them, but our kids use them back with us, which is actually a good thing, and it makes sense. Because if you as a student want to mutually create a relationship with your instructor, you're going to be nonverbally immediate. Okay, you're going to use maybe a particular affinity seeking strategy that students would use. You might engage in nonverbal responsiveness. You might also be conforming, which we'll talk about in a second. All right, so when we look at this list, though, what I would rather do for the time being is just talk about 10 strategies that we have found to consistently be linked with learning outcomes or other positive teaching behaviors. Okay, so if you remember back to day one, we talked about Nussbaum's definition of teaching effectiveness. Those behaviors that are directly related to student learning outcomes or to positive teaching evaluations. That's really the idea here, is if you engage in affinity seeking, again, like a lot of these things are going to go better for both the student and the actual classroom interaction. But here are 10 behaviors, and you can look on table 1 to look at the actual examples. But here are 10 behaviors or 10 affinity seeking strategies that consistently have been found to be effective. So the first one, these are in no particular orders. The first one's called facilitate enjoyment. And the idea behind this is you want to get your students to find that your time together is enjoyable. And I think most of us who taught for a while will agree with that. I mean, an enjoyable interaction makes teaching go a long way. There's nothing worse than going into a classroom where it's not fun. And remember, you set the tone for a lot of this. So if you're not excited about the subject matter, how can you expect your students to be? Some subject matter, and some of our courses are more, I guess they're more dull. And I don't want to say which one. You know what I'm talking about. Some classes, like if you teach an interpersonal class, you generally are going to have a nice time because students can relate to those topics. When you teach some other classes, they may not be as enjoyable to students initially, right? That's our job to do that. So facilitate enjoyment. You engage in strategies to get students to like the course material. The second strategy is called optimism, right? If we want people to like us, we need to be optimistic. If we want us to like the content, we need to be optimistic. A third one, assume equality. Present yourself as an equal with the student. Now, we know that can be difficult sometimes because we're not equals, right? We have legitimate power, we're in charge, but that doesn't mean you can't communicate in a way that stresses the equality, apologizing when you're wrong, not over-talking students, not talking over students, that makes better sense. Being respectful of a divergent opinion. We want that from them, we need to give it right back. So assume equality. It's all about your communication behavior, not the legitimate role that you carry in the classroom. Conversational rule keeping goes along with that well. Conversational rule keeping means you just follow the rules for polite conversation. Again, it's not a one-sided monologue, it's a dialogue between the two of us. A comfortable self, which I think is interesting. You have to be relaxed and at ease. And again, think back to Kramer and Peer on day 1. The casual/approachable instructor is an effective teaching behavior. So if you are a little more uptight or reserved in nature, then you may need to relax it a little bit when you're teaching. Okay, it doesn't mean you're giving up control. It just means, that you're being comfortable with yourself. Being dynamic, all right, communicating in a dynamic manner. Eliciting disclosure from students. We'd be careful with that one just because we know that a lot of us realize that disclosure is governed by the norm of reciprocity, where if a student discloses something, you disclose back, usually on an equal level. But you can get students to disclose, because you do disclose. When you are, that's one way in which we establish our homophily or even our attraction to students, by disclosing how you felt about a class. When I taught methods before, I'll talk about how I was terrified as an undergrad to take methods. So it's little things like that, and then people can self-disclose back. Being altruistic, right? When you're altruistic, what you can do, when you're being altruistic, you're just doing things to be helpful, and there's nothing wrong with that. You're not being a pushover, you're being altruistic. And then listening, of course, a big one. Sometimes when students come to my office, that's all they're there to do is to talk and I listen. There's really not much to resolve. There's not even necessarily a question to be asked. It's just listening. And that's nice to do. And then being sensitive, all right? Communicating in a empathic manner, showing that you care. Again, going back to that caring dimension and credibility, maybe being sympathetic to problems. Doesn't mean you excuse issues, but you can be empathic or sympathetic with those issues. So that's the idea here behind affinity seeking. Like I said, if you read when you read the Wands article, she's also going to have, and I'll just read these real quick because I find them intriguing, is that students use a lot of the same strategies we use. So those 10 we use, several of those 10 students use as well. But students also use, here's 4 that students use that are unique to the affinity seeking literature. And remember, affinity seeking is to gain liking. So one is through achievement. The student attempts to gain liking from you by doing well in the class. Okay? So those students who write extra on their assignments, even though it's not required, some of the students who do every extra credit activity, they might be doing it as a way to generate liking from you. Now they could be doing it for other reasons too, but just keep that in mind. Gifts is another example that Melissa Wanzer found, is that when students give you a gift, they might do that to gain liking. It is nice, I think, sometimes when you get a gift from a student that's pretty impromptu, meaning you must have said something in class, and they think of you or give you something, doesn't have to be a high monetary value, but they're like, oh, I saw that, I thought of you. And obviously that's probably going to work, right? You're going to like that student. Flirting, so it's kind of interesting. So students might flirt with you as a way to gain liking. That happens probably more than we think. And then requirements is where the student just follows the rules. Think about that. We comment all the time. We like a student because they do what I say, right? And students they're cognizant of that as well. Okay. So again, when you look at the Wanzer article, it's actually table 1 I've been talking about. These are the strategies that students use. The last 4 are unique to students. The others are strategies that instructors use as well. So do keep that in mind when you're reading that article. And then we're going to switch over for a few minutes and talk about confirmation. Confirmation has been gaining more attention in the instructional literature. It also, and I should point out too, all of the stuff we've talked about really, the immediacy, affinity seeking, and confirmation is stemmed from interpersonal communication research or from social psychology that we brought over into the classroom because it makes sense, again, when you're teaching from a relational perspective. So confirmation is interesting because the purpose of engaging confirmation is basically when you engage in confirmation or engage in confirming behaviors with your students, you are telling them that they're valued. You're acknowledging who they are as people. You're telling them that they're valuable. Did I just say that? I might have just said that. But you're acknowledging their presence as a person. You're signifying that they're important. You're signifying that they're valuable. So basically, students feel good when you engage in confirmation. They feel like they're part of the classroom enterprise. And what we have found over the years is that generally, one of the best ways in which you can engage in confirmation, actually there's really 2 great ways in which you engage in confirmation, is by responding to student questions and comments. And when I say responding, I'm not talking about a cursory response. I'm talking about actually, acknowledging the response, probably acknowledging their name, and then talking a little bit about it. If it's not relevant at the moment, you just make a note to the student. Okay, good question. Bring it up in 10 minutes or so. You also demonstrate an interest in students, which is important. Again, going back to some of the impressions. the students might make of us if we're caring. Again, we're warm, we're empathic, we're responsive, or even just one way. This is one way in which we can be probably seen as task attractive, is by demonstrating an interest in students. Now, interestingly, we find that this behavior is important. We find that instructors don't engage in confirmation as much as students would like. Students want more of this behavior. And unlike nonverbal immediacy, which you could argue is, a group of nonverbal behaviors, or affinity seeking, which, would be those 25 strategies, there may not be, there's not really a list of confirming behaviors per se. And some research has found that students report that when instructors self-disclose, or that when they engage in nonverbal immediacy, that's how they feel confirmed. So it's not as if I just do behavior X and I feel confirmed, right? Now, if I respond to their questions, if I demonstrate interest in them, that helps tremendously. But we have to just keep in mind that there might be some other behaviors that contribute to it indirectly. So students might not say that I'm confirming because I'm confirming, but it's because I'm immediate. And they take that immediacy as a confirmation. So that's one thing to keep in mind here, is that we're finding more and more students want us to be confirming. And again, remember, when you engage in confirmation, all you're doing, and not all, but you're really just letting the student know that they're valuable. They're part of that classroom. They're necessary. You appreciate them being there. You like having them in class. And that is important to students. When they know that you've taken an interest in them, they're going to be less likely to misbehave, less likely to miss class, more likely to tell you why. So that's going to affect their excuse-making motive in some way as well. Generally, when students, one of the articles one of the readings that you can look at is Goodboy and Myers. Alan Goodboy was my advisee at the time. This was based on his doctoral dissertation, and essentially, what we found was that when students have a confirming teacher, they participate more in class, they're more motivated, they feel more understood, they feel as if their classmates are supportive. I mean, confirmation may play a much bigger role than we think. We also know that confirmation plays a role with the emotional component of the classroom. What I mean by that is, when students believe that you're engaging in confirmation with them, they're more, they consider the classroom to be more positively valenced. So you're going to have a stronger, more effective classroom climate. They're going to feel they're going to experience greater emotional interest, which means that they're going to find the material enjoyment. They're going to find the material enjoying. They're going to enjoy the material, right? There's going to be a sense of arousal with the material, and that they also believe there's more emotional support, right? They can say things, they can talk to you, they can even have an outburst in class that's not going to be sanctioned, right? Because they understand that you realize that they're important. And think about that, sometimes we have students who behave in ways that they probably should not, but maybe that's because they don't feel as if they're part of the classroom. And like I said earlier, I think it was day 2 where, we may not sometimes think that's our job to worry about their basic needs, but those basic needs surface in how they treat us and how they treat their classmates. So it is something to consider. All right, so again, looks like we're out of time. All right, so today we talked about the relational perspective of teaching, and talked a little bit about being nonverbally immediate, using affinity seeking strategies, and engaging in confirming behaviors or confirmation. So similar to yesterday, when we finish, I'd like you to just think about, how do you use these behaviors? Are these important to you? Do your students respond to these behaviors? Some of these are going to be maybe more student or more classroom or more institutional specific. So think about how you use these behaviors, and then tomorrow we're going to talk about your presentational style, where all this stuff is going to come together. All right, see you tomorrow. Have a good rest of your day.